Is this a rectangle? Give evidence. Why or why not? Now, first let's just recall some properties of rectangles. A rectangle has, of course, 4 sides, and the opposite sides are both congruent and parallel. But more than that, the angles in a rectangle are all right angles. So, in order to determine if this figure here is a rectangle, we need to decide if the sides are parallel and congruent, and if the angles are right angles. Now, another thing to recall is that lines with the same slope are parallel, and lines that are perpendicular have slopes that are opposite reciprocals. So, if this figure here is a rectangle, that means these two lines would have to be perpendicular so that they form right angles, which means that the slopes of these two lines would have to be opposite reciprocals. Well, let's determine the slope of this line. The slope of a line is the change in y over the change in x. So if we take these two convenient points, we can see that the change in y is 1, and the change in x is 3. So the slope of this line is 1/3. Now, let's find the slope of this line. We can see that from this point to this point, we are going down 3 and over 1, so its slope is -3/1. And we see that these slopes are indeed opposite reciprocals, which means that this is a right angle. Now, we can see that this line, it also has a slope of 1/3, just as this line here. So that means that these lines are parallel, and that means this would have to be a right angle as well. And this line here, we can see that its slope is -3/1, just like this line. So that means that this line is perpendicular to this line, and this line is perpendicular to that line. We can also see that the opposite sides are not only parallel, but they're also congruent, because we can see that if we go down 3/1, and this segment over here, down 3/1, that means those two segments would have to be the same length. And by a similar argument, we could say that these would have to be congruent. So, is this a rectangle? Yes, it is. Now, you might be wondering why it doesn't look like a rectangle. In fact, if you look at these angles, they certainly don't look like right angles. The reason this doesn't really look like a right angle is because of the window, if you will, of this graph. You can see that the horizontal units are much larger than the vertical units. If you were to change the scaling of this graph so that the horizontal units and the vertical units were the same, this would look more rectangular. But back to our evidence. Is this a rectangle? Yes, it is. The lines form right angles. By the way, this symbol here is the symbol for angle. right angles. The lines form right angles because they have opposite reciprocal slopes. So, for the big idea, I would simply reiterate these two statements, that lines with the same slope are parallel, and lines that are perpendicular have slopes that are opposite reciprocals.